Hello, everyone, and welcome to another asug affiliate webcast. My name is Anna McMurrow, Sales Engagement Coordinator here at asug headquarters in Chicago. Today's webcast, The Power of User Adoption Analytics, is brought to you by Neochange. Today's webcast is being recorded. That recording and the accompanying slides will be posted to the asug website, and all registrants will receive an email with a link to those materials. Our speakers today are Terry Walker, User Sustainment Expert formerly with McKesson and now an SAP Insight Board member, Michael Zeldenrust, SAP Application Management for the City of Edmonton, and Chris Dowse, Founder and Chief Adoption Analyst with Neochange. I'd like to remind our audience members that you can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking the purple Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
Great. Thank you for that intro, and thanks to everyone that's made the time today to come and attend this session. I'm really excited about this session. Just to sort of quickly recap, if you're not here for user adoption analytics, then you're in the wrong place. Hopefully, as we talk as a group today about the different aspects of using user adoption analytics, that several things should come through for you in terms of what can you do or what would you do different as a SAP practitioner if you had 100% user transparency. Also, one of our key messages is really this concept of how we separate signals from the noise. So really using data maybe instead of instinct, and really then how do you use that to make decisions around investments. And then finally, we all need to do a good job of communicating what we do and how well we do it. So we're really going to talk about how you can scale your services and communicate more of the impact that you bring to bear in your company. So I'm very lucky today, as the brief intro there, to have two award-winning colleagues with me. So I'm going to let Michael, why don't you quickly just talk a little bit about, the City of Edmonton and sort of the location of your program within that, and then Terry, we'll sort of have you talk similarly about McKesson. So Mike, you want to sort of just quickly give them some sense of your program there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Zeldenrust. So as the intro said, I'm the manager for SAP Application Management for the City of Edmonton. For those of you who don't know where Edmonton is, we are a city of about 1 million people in Alberta. I think we're probably the northernmost major city in Canada. So my role is to lead a team on the business side of things that coordinates closely with our IT folks, and acts as a centralized hub to lead a number of different SAP improvement initiatives that we have at the City of Edmonton right now. Those would include things such as our Business Process Champions program, which is our City of Edmonton branded super user program, our Center of Excellence, and as well as a larger program that we're calling SAP Renewal, which is all around increasing adoption through some modernization efforts with SAP. So I'm going to get into more detail on some of those things as I get into some of the different slides. Terry?
Right. Terry, you want to talk about?
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Walker, and I have over 10 years of building high-performance teams of super users for Fortune 500 companies, the latest being McKesson, which is the oldest and largest healthcare company in the nation, ranked currently 11 on the Fortune 500 list, and they have approximately over 76,000 employees worldwide, with an annual revenue of about $190 billion. McKesson delivers about 1/3 of the medicines and medications used every day in North America. I'm also a member of SAP's Super User Community Leaderboard, and I work with other super user leaders to improve their programs for other organizations. So I'm here today because I have the pleasure of working with Chris since 2011, and learning and utilizing the data that Neochange provided to recruit and grow our super user network at McKesson and identify where support was truly needed. So with that, Chris, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Terry, yeah, that is quite a while that we've worked together. So in terms of my role, I've been working on user adoption as my sole focus for over 15 years, or 16 years, I guess, with Neochange. And I really am passionate about, helping companies make their users successful. I think that it's smart business. Today we're so dependent on technology. The users are increasingly the source of value. And I think, as the shifts in our labor force happen and we see this, constant reminder of consumer-friendly technologies, that really the way that we treat our users and how we help them adopt technology is really going to be a leadership issue more and more as we move forward. In terms of the obligatory plug for our company, as it goes to SAP more specifically today, we've basically analyzed over 3 billion user transactions since we launched our user analytics a few years ago. We've put out some great thought leadership, I think, around the state of adoption. So we have some, reports around what companies are doing to get better adoption, how they've struggled with adoption, and we'll have another survey coming out and a research report coming out later in the year. In terms of our analytics, they've really stood up to, small users, 500 all the way through to 60,000, and we've done that across multiple industries. And then, we think that the companies that we work with, our leaders, are doing a great job for their users, but we're not the only ones. So SAP themselves have given awards to companies such as McKesson and the super user program there, and then definitely, the SAP Insight community having awarded multiple customers of ours awards. And so I think, the point there is that I really feel that the use of technology, the use of the analytics is going to be more and more important. So let's move into the webinar itself. And as Anna said at the beginning, we're going to take some questions in the middle and some questions at the end. So as we go along, type them in and we'll get to you either in the middle or the end. So contextually, what is the world that we are all living in as SAP practitioners? So if you are in development, if you're responsible for training, or we just heard Michael, responsible for process adoption and Terry responsible for super use programs, then really we are constantly being bombarded by changes, whether that be, technology change, the users are changing. And really, as we sort of move forward and changes happen in your business, then, we're always faced with the politics of, large organizations, different interests from different groups, the politics of squeaky wheels. And so then you add to that the complexity of SAP. So really, we live in this world where sometimes it feels like, as individual practitioners, that we're quite powerless. And really, I think, conceptually, when you think about what you're trying to do with your user services, your user program, it's hard to get your head around, well, how do I deal with, all these changes, the complexity and the politics? And then really that's further complicated by a situation where, we really don't have good transparency at the center of all these changes that I just mentioned. So, any one of these areas, so if we said we were, doing major process changes as organizations every 2 to 3 years, that in itself would have been enough complexity and change. But, like if we take McKesson, for example, 30% of the users are brand new to SAP in the past, 18 months. So that's a lot of new users, a lot of complexity to deal with, even if the technology itself didn't change. So at the center of that, we're having user productivity losses. We're spending on technology and development that maybe isn't the wisest investment. And really then, we have these issues where we aren't getting the process adoption that we want. So on average, SAP companies are probably only adopting, less than 50% of what they had hoped in terms of what their users are doing. Okay, so what's the point here? Well, the point is that I think everybody really wants to do the best job they can. And so if you don't have this transparency, it's really hard to push back on this complexity and this rate of change. So what we're going to do now for the next 35, 40 minutes is really walk you through a number of examples, use cases, if you will, where using user adoption analytics can actually help you push back on this change, push back on this complexity, get a handle on it, if you will. So we're going to talk about the power of user adoption analytics in three ways. The first is, what could you do, what would you do if you had complete transparency of where all your users spend their time, whether that be desktop users, mobile users, RF device users, your partners outside your company. Really, what could we do differently if we knew exactly the scale of usage and more importantly, the time behind that? And then, secondly, we're going to talk about the kinds of operating decisions that can be enabled by user adoption analytics. How would we invest differently? What would you do as a different approach if you had more transparency and were able to use the insight to make more informed decisions? And then finally, we're going to talk about this concept that I call information asymmetry. Really that's a fancy way of talking about, something that the rest of your colleagues don't know. So there's this difference in this gap between one group having, unique information that another group does, and how can you use that unique position to make yourself more valuable to your organization. So I'm going to swap over now to the visuals, and we're going to sort of share the floor here in terms of the discussion. So just give me a second here as I swap this over. Okay. So I think we're good to go here. So Michael, I'm going to hand this over to you. Why don't you talk a little bit about this visualization, the constructive time, and sort of how that affects where you might focus, your program.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, one of my roles, and the initial role that I had when getting involved with SCP management was designing and kicking off a super user program here at the City of Edmonton. We're by no means finished with that task. We've got our program designed and underway, but very quickly we ran into the concept of how are we going to steer this thing? How do we make informed decisions? In any public sector organization, I'm sure in all organizations, but particularly in the public sector, when you're dealing with taxpayers' funding, it's imperative that you're making decisions that are based on data. You're not going with your gut. You're not going with what you think is the best practice, but you're making decisions that are reflective of data. So what we wanted to do right from the get-go when we were designing a super user program that was going to be effective in improving our adoption was ensure that we used a tool that would tell us how are we using SAP, who is using SAP, what are our strengths, what are we not doing so well, and how do we improve that. So that was the initial reason that we engaged with Neochange. We ran a 2-month baseline report. So we took a period of 2 months and watched all of the transactions that were running across the organization in that time. And we've sorted all those transactions kind of according to our org chart a little bit. We've mapped them to the various business units that we have. And by doing that, we were able to very quickly, this is one of the very first slides that you see in the report, but just right off the bat, we can see where our big user groups are, what transactions we're running, and then when you drill down into some of those, you start seeing some of the metrics and how those different transactions are affecting our productivity and how good effectively we're doing at them. How long do we take to run them? How many users are running them? All those sorts of data. So what that told us was in the red there, that's our procurement area. So what that tells us right off the bat, without even drilling down into any detail, is that procurement is clearly one of the areas that we need to talk to about implementing this because they are one of our largest users. That didn't surprise us. That was what we expected. The purple area below, that's our facilities maintenance team. They use our primarily plant maintenance. And again, that wasn't a surprise to us, but a lot of this was validating, and it really helps us to make informed decisions so that when we go run this program, when we pitch the super user program to the different business units within the city, we're not trying to do it all at once. We're going to do it in a staged, controlled manner, and we're going to the areas where we're going to see the most results. We're going to get the most bang for our buck. I'm going to touch on the finance example there. That's the blue set of boxes. I'm going to touch on them in a little while when we talk a little bit about some of the other conversations that have happened as a result of seeing this data. But just right off the bat, this has helped us have conversations with those areas about the way that they use the tool, the number of users they have, and how we can effectively support them. What kind of needs do they have from a user adoption standpoint?
And Michael, from a sort of a City of Edmonton-wide view, as opposed to just sort of your bailiwick, what's the concept there in terms of using information or using data to support decisions and investments there? How's that maybe different to companies, or how's that been changing in the City of Edmonton? Can you sort of just comment on that?
Well, it's a key strategy in all of our areas, not in IT governance or application governance, in all of our areas, that decisions have to be backed up by data. I touched on that a second ago. We are moving in that direction more and more, and I think all companies are probably doing that. But particularly in the public sector, it's critical for us that we have a culture that's based on data-driven decision-making. We make good decisions based on the data that's available to us, and we can report on that data. The other nice thing of having this data available to us is that we can track our performance as well. We can see the results of what we're doing. When you are making intuitive-based decisions, or we are steering this based on best practices or leading practices, it can be challenging to measure the results. When our decisions and the programs we implement are based on data, we can continually track that data and we can see what the results are of those programs.
Great. Thanks for that. Okay, Terry, so I'm going to throw the next one over to you in terms of discussing sort of how, to Michael's point, you might use the information to focus. So you want to sort of talk to this one?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Michael. And as Michael was talking, for him, the way that he took a look at that view is the larger the box, the larger number of users. And what was so nice about the data that we received from Neochange is it could be also disseminated down to a process level. So, for example, on the right, you'll see that customer support is the process. And in here, all of these bubbles represent users within the customer support area. And along this matrix, you could see on the x-axis, you could see the productivity, how productive they are using the system. And then on the y-axis, you could see the consumption level. How often are they using the system? Well, from a super user standpoint, and looking, you could see that there are a large number of folks in this drag zone, or folks that may be using the system very well, but maybe not as productive. I mean, they're using it a lot, but not being very productive in the system. So from when we went live on travel and expense, one of the things that we did was Chris definitely took a 2-month baseline and then began to show us which we called all of these users, we called them Clark Kents. They were not yet out of the phone booth wearing their Superman cape, but they were in that power zone up there on that upper right-hand quadrant and being productive and utilizing this new rollout of our expense management solution that we had put in for SAP. And not only were they using it, but they were using it at a level of about 85% productivity. So we began to immediately reach out to that group in order to recruit and onboard and train super users to support this 2-year implementation that we had, which I'll go in and talk to at another slide, for our travel and expense solution. So it was a wonderful way to immediately reach out to someone and say, not only are you using the system, but you're using it well. Hey, the fact that you are using it well, you're already probably getting requests for support. Help us support our other users by becoming a super user. And we were able to recruit over 200 super users for 10,000 corporate card holders, so making a ratio of about 1 super user to 20 end users for a good number of support when you launch a brand new initiative. So, Chris, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. I think, as Terry said, to simplify, being able to have some objective measure, even if you question, whether a level of consumption or a level of user productivity is good or bad, having this relative view is powerful. And I think, as Terry said, we were able to recruiting people into the super user program based on their actual heavy consumption and they're doing well. That's obviously valuable if you've sort of inherited, super users that maybe weren't so good or the program needs to be refreshed. And then I think, Terry, the other thing that you said, or maybe you would elaborate a bit more, is the concept of, what kind of interventions, how did we reach out, or how did we support people that we felt were in the drag zone and that could do some support there? So how did we sort of do that there at McKesson?
So, and in bringing the super users on board, it was then being able to share that knowledge through being able to contact a super user with those how-to type of questions for those new folks that were struggling, whether they just were rolled out, because we rolled out this tool over a 2-year process and in a waved approach. And as new organizations came on board, you'll start to see that in another slide. But in here, it was being able then to get them direct contact to a super user who can then bring up, their productivity through their knowledge, right? And being able to share that knowledge and share screens so that the end user, if they had just a simple how-to type of question, they could share their screen with their super user guiding them, and they would actually be doing the transaction themselves. So it worked out very well, and I'll talk more about that in another slide.
Right. So I would take the sort of this concept of digging into user productivity and looking at their time one step further. So what we have here is a situation where a finance group wanted to get a sense of what was really going on in their process. And I think, in terms of, what Terry was talking to before in terms of productivity being a focus, when we start to dig down into an individual area, we can see here we have these different types of waste. So we've got some, usability kinds of issues with the configuration we've set up. We've got some cycle time issues in the sense of how, users are doing versus their peers, technology response waste. And in this example here, user confusion waste. So this is really an example where a large amount of users in the invoice processing area were, hitting native help in SAP so we can actually see that, canceling transactions and so on, so a bit of issue there. And then, when we looked at the distribution of the user base in the actual purchasing portal, we could see that really, as you'd kind of expect, the lighter, more casual users were the ones that struggled the most, as they sort of forgot what they needed to do. So, what I'm trying to communicate here is we can add, we're adding color to a specific process area. We're looking at T codes, scaled based on time. And we're starting to dig into the nature of time and sort of how some of this user productivity is lost. And a couple of other things that I would mention before we might pause for some questions is, conceptually we're able to look at then, how does this process do versus other processes in the company as we think about productivity levels and also usability issues, because we're really trying to figure out how as an organization are we going to invest our money moving forward. And so if we said, well, we're going to do it based on all the people that complain about functionality X, well, that's one way to do it, but if we find that, those people are natural whiners and we find that a third of the user base is not having an issue with a specific area, then we're going to question whether, we really need to invest there. Whereas, we might find other aspects around technology performance that maybe we should consider HANA. Maybe we should really look at simplifying some of these T codes and removing some custom functionality. So it's really a concept of looking deeper into time, productivity, to look at all these different factors. So I'm just going to pause here for a second. We're sort of about halfway in here. And Anna, maybe I'll throw it back to you, or do we have any sort of questions that have come in so far around the usage of time, or maybe some of the context that we positioned earlier?
Yeah, Chris, we did actually have a couple questions come in. Audience members, if you do have a question as of right now, our speakers would be happy to take them. So Chris, the first question I'll throw to you, what kinds of challenges are faced when you start communicating what people are actually using versus what we thought they were doing?
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe Michael, do you want to have a go with that one? Because I know you've told me a couple of tales around sort of what happens when you start to talk about, discussing time and so on. Do you want to go there first?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my experience, as we started presenting some of this data around our corporation, talking to the different business areas, it was a very interesting dynamic that people are fascinated by the concept of tracking data. And then as soon as you mention that you can get down to the granularity of tracking it per user, all of a sudden everybody kind of shrivels up a little bit. So we tried hard not to focus on what exactly the productivity number was, because we know that we're still very early in our SAP renewal program. We're very early in the implementation of a super user program. We used it more from an indication standpoint. So we tried not to focus on, where, exactly that you're at 82% productivity versus you're at 86% productivity, but more as an indicator that, if we compared ourselves to other similarly sized organizations, it looks like we could do better in this area, or it looks like we're doing fairly well in this other area. We tried to kind of take some of that granularity out. Now, having that granularity available to us in the future could certainly be valuable. I think we will get to a stage where we'll definitely want to get a little pickier about how we use the data. But for now, particularly for some of our leaders, it's really just a bunch of arrows. Are we trending in the right direction? Are we going up or are we going down, depending on what metrics we're looking at and productivity, what sorts of waste, for example, we're talking about.
Great. Anna, do we have any others?
Yeah, actually another question just came in that I'm going to give to you guys, which is, are the images and dashboard generated by the Neochange application?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. What I thought that we might do, since, when we work with our clients, we're always trying to help them build stories and mix and match some of the views that we have. So in this instance, all the things you're seeing are built from us capturing, user at the application server level, every click of every user, and then we're rolling it up into different reporting formats. And then what we do then thereafter, and we're going to see a couple of examples next, is really, and maybe that's a great segue back to the visuals, we mix and match different standard views then to build stories to help our customers make decisions. And I might use that as a segue back to you, Michael, in saying, so we're combining two views that we've already looked at, usage and then, the consumption levels of the departments here. Maybe we go back to you and say, what were the implications here, or what decisions kind of were made thereafter in the context of your, SAP renewal project?
Sure. Before I dive into that, Chris, I'll go back to the question just for a second. You did mention that the visualizations are done using Tableau, which actually, from a City of Edmonton perspective, was quite beneficial. As I understand it, and Chris, feel free to elaborate if you like, the data is all getting dumped into Tableau, which is producing the visualizations, obviously, through the Neochange application. That enabled us at the City of Edmonton to be able to take our baseline report that was produced by Neochange and be able to open it up, because we also use Tableau for a number of visualizations. So we could use that visualization report directly and open it up across all the people at the city here who have licenses for that tool. And that actually ended up being very handy for us.
Yeah, so thanks for Michael for saying that. So basically, after we've processed the data in our cloud and converted it into all these great metrics, then we do actually serve up access to the visualizations in portable workbooks via the Tableau platform, as he said. And we chose that one over various different platforms, A, because we actually had a lot of customers that already used it, and B, it was just really a nice way. One of the concerns people have when they're doing a user analytic program is, who controls the data? How do I get access to it? Can I change things? And so as Michael was just saying, if your organization has really competent people that use these kinds of tools, then all the information that we process and transform can be shifted across. And I would use City of Cameron International as an example. They had their Six Sigma people creating their own unique views off of the information that we produce. So thanks for saying that, Michael. And I'll let you go back to this one.
Sure. So you were asking about what kind of decisions and what kind of other discussions resulted around our ability now to view our consumption. So this slide that you're looking at here is kind of an amalgamation of two different charts. It was interesting that Terry spoke to the user metabolism matrix, but more from a user perspective, you could tell that she had a lot more dots on her graph than I do. What we've done at the city was we didn't get as granular as down to the user level. What we did was we focused kind of at the business area level. So each of those dots for us is a business area that's utilizing SAP. What that means for us is that we were able to see, okay, which business areas, what's their consumption versus what's their productivity look like, average productivity for their users. And that started telling us some interesting stories again. So similar to the previous slide that I talked about, now we're able to go have conversations with business areas about how much of SAP they're using. And that has sparked a very interesting conversation across the city of Edmonton, and we've actually just embarked on a much larger program, which we're calling SAP Renewal, which is, as I said off the top, all about improving our overall adoption. We pay for a fairly large enterprise license, as I'm sure many of you on the call do, and we use a significantly smaller percentage of that license. So what we're really striving to do is improve that level of adoption and get more value out of the SAP application. We've done a number of studies and had consultants in over the last several years, and we think we have a pretty good handle on why business areas maybe aren't using SAP as frequently as we'd like them to or as much as we'd like them to, and maybe where some of the struggles are as far as using it effectively. So what that's really enabled us to do is have this project or this program around SAP Renewal to start removing some of those barriers. So some examples would be training, for example, or process standardization, where we have multiple business areas using the same functionality within SAP, or could be using the same functionality, but they have slightly different business processes, or sometimes dramatically different business processes. This enables us to have a conversation with all those areas and say, look, here's the delivered process within SAP compared to your custom process and your custom process, and you guys, which have a similar process, but you've decided to go in a completely different way and use a different tool. We can start having those conversations with them and trying to consolidate within one system. And then on the other hand, we can go back to looking at what transactions are being run. And what we have there from our finance area is an interesting story that got told about consumption. The biggest transaction that we run within our finance department is a custom variance report. Now, as it turns out, there's some very good logical business reasons for that. We use that report all the way across our corporation, and a lot of people run it. But it's interesting from an overall consumption standpoint at the city that the largest volume transaction we run within SAP is a custom variance report, as opposed to being a delivered transactional report or something along those kind of lines. Excuse me. So that really enables me to be able to go have conversations with areas about opportunities to consolidate functionality and look for opportunities to get greater value out of the tool. And occasionally we can have conversations about business process, and that leads to a lot of the initiatives that we're working on right now around the Center of Excellence, for example, which is responsible for some business standardization and process standardization efforts. Training is an obstacle, which leads back to the super user program, and where do we need that most importantly. So really all this data has enabled a lot of discussion about how we use SAP and are we getting the value out of it.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Terry, do you want to talk to this next construct and sort of talk about the decisions that you made around coverage for your super users? I know that's sort of always been an interesting concept for the space. So do you want to talk to this next concept?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Michael. Really great detail. I appreciate the elaboration that you went to on showing where reporting, or what was being used, and showing opportunities as well. And here, it was also another opportunity for us. In this, when you're looking at this adoption landscape, and again, I first began with that super user program thinking, a good ratio of super users or for coverage would be about one super user to anywhere from 20 to 40, depending on how new an application was that folks needed to learn. As they learned it, there's less need for super user support because people are really learning the process. But I was taking that ratio and kind of putting it across the organization, and it wasn't until we really started looking at the data to say, well, you know what, maybe that 1 to 20 ratio isn't necessarily the blanket rule for everything. Now that I started looking at it, for example, if you look at the process of travel management, that was a large process. And in this snapshot, it could have been a monthly snapshot where we had approximately over 6,200 users using that tool. And the productivity there was decent productivity. Folks were having about 81%, but we had a lot of light users, 1%. Maybe those are the folks that were just entering an expense report once every 6 months. So folks are really kind of getting that. So it didn't seem like that would be an area where I would really need to focus a lot of super user support. Whereas if I look down to the next process of, say, customer support, yeah, it's still a large process. We had a large group of users using it with an average productivity of around 82%. However, too, we have a lot of heavy users in that area. More reasons that we would need more super user support in this area because folks are going to be coming on, they're using it a lot, they may be coming across questions, and we would need to have super users in that area. Moving down the slide a little bit, if you look at, say, accounting, in the accounting area, you can see that the user count is sort of like a medium process. It's got some really lower than what we would like productivity, but they have a lot of heavy users as well on an average workday. So that would be an area, too, that we want to really focus on, where are we getting the biggest bang for our buck, and where the data is showing us where we need to provide more education, whether is it job aids, is it more training, is it a CBT, or is it just making sure that they know that there are super users out there in that area that can support them with those day-to-day type of questions. So again, that was a huge eye-opener for me to say that, wow, maybe 1 to 20 ratio across the board isn't what is right. The data is now showing me where I need to look for additional recruits for super users to support those appropriate business users.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And I think, I would reiterate that theme of focus, based on time and need, right, versus sort of a blanket rule for everyone. What I'm showing here right now is a more advanced view. This is a sort of a workflow view of the order to cash process. And, what we're seeing then is the movement between two core SAP instances, and then all the flow between either the T codes that are utilized or the CRM web components. And really this whole concept of prioritization and focus, really in this story, it was more a case of, if we're trying to get a better performance here, if we've got almost 2,000 users and economic valuation of the user productivity opportunity using their average labor rate, then where are we going to focus and spend the money? And so I think in this instance, there was a thought process that, it was all going to be usability. And so, I'll just highlight a few concepts here. Definitely, the company knew that they had built this integration to come between CRM and the ECC. And this was the expected route here for people to look up information about orders related to customers when they're on the phone. And so we saw that we were actually seeing some technology response time issues happening there. And then so what was unexpected then as a sort of a workaround to that is people were coming back in through ECC Session Manager and coming into the same T-code area through a back door and then trying to run multiple sessions at once and you know, making help requests there. And I guess there were several problems with that. You know, it takes a lot more time to get from, you know, come in the other way when you should really be able to access something quickly at the front end here. And also, as part of coming in that back door, it meant that, you know, some of the controls around, you know, pricing and so on were sort of open to exposure. So, you know, in that instance, the concept of investing in the usability around maybe adding some type of, you know, user experience front end work and also some back end technology performance work really made sense. But we also knew that in the extended resolution and really in the identify account, so the core bread and butter activities of these agents, they really weren't having a bad user productivity issue. So the concept of investing then in streamlining the click stream, really didn't make as much sense. So the concept that I'm trying to communicate here then is really usability versus user. Some parts of this, you know, was dragging them down, and so we can invest there, but in others, not so much. Okay, so we're going to move into the next section of this concept of information asymmetry. So really that's the idea that, you know, you have some information that's unique that you bring back to your organization, and from that, you know, you look good, and hopefully, you know, it helps raise your, you know, relative worth at your company. And so in this instance, we're looking at a logistics process. So we're looking at a pretty large user base here of almost 4,000 users, you know, in terms of this organization's activity in the logistics area. And we have, you know, 200 plus companies, you know, that have given us process information through surveys, and we have, you know, 20 plus companies where we've got that deep dive T-code level. But really, you know, I was skeptical at first of could we really benchmark one company's process to another, even though all the people that I was working with were saying, please do that because we want to get a sense of it. But it actually does work, and it does work when you're using the same metrics, you know, across organizations, even though, you know, configurations can be different. And so, you know, for example, when we compared to this group, you know, a reasonably sized group there of 1,200 users, same level of consumption as sort of the target audience, but, you know, much worse productivity. So what can we learn about what's happening here versus here, or maybe, you know, from these outliers? And I think in this example, you know, it really became obvious pretty quickly that, you know, really there were some issues around technical performance. There were some issues around the level of help requests going on. So really then, you know, we were able to target the training and really support some of those usability decisions, just like I was talking about previously. Moving right along in terms of discussing information asymmetry. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Terry. And why don't you want to share with the people what we're looking at here and sort of how that related to, you know, revealing things that the company may have known or didn't know, but you were able to bring something new to the company, and what was that view? So I'll throw it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And this particular slide really was one of our success stories here. And hold on one second, I've got this little slide here. And so you could see that based off of the bottom here, we began our travel and expense tool. We rolled it out in January 2012. So during that time, Chris had taken a baseline of those users who had begun using the tool. And right then you could begin with the March of 2012. Our first change was implementing a new portal-based front end for folks to enter in their travel and expense reports. With that, our productivity in March, and again, we rolled out in a waved approach, our productivity in March was around 68%. But you can notice that the call volume was off the charts. It was going to the calls to the support desk. People were struggling with this new tool, and it was about 1,400 calls to the support desk, which normally our call volume would be approximately anywhere from 700 to 800 on an average basis, on an average monthly basis. And so what happened then is, as we began to take this data and from there, we recruited our super users. We're continuing to train during the month, but our team was building CBTs, building web pages to host that information. We are still recruiting more super users through these different waves and training them to support their end users. And you could start to see that then within at least a month or two, the call volume began to drop and then drastically drop, because then we started to identify, hey, these users are calling the help desk repeatedly for the same thing. So we would send out these friendly reminders. Chris used to love to call it love for the laggards, and because they just weren't jumping on board with looking at the self-help material that we had available and or calling the super user for support. And these kind of how-to type of questions, like how do I itemize my hotel receipt? How do I calculate my mileage? Where do I scan? What happens when I exceed my meal limit for the day? Those kind of things. So as you could start to see that the call volume began to drop drastically within just a couple of months of implementing this, down to almost half, right? The call volume then had jumped down to, I want to say, close to 800 calls a month versus 1,400 calls a month. Then we had a new change. We had new processes come in. We implemented within the travel and expense system right around the end of 2012. We started to say, well, now we're going to implement spend limits in there. So all of a sudden, boom, when you introduce this change, the call volume jumps again. And at that same time, we continue to address it with super user support, education, and reaching out to that end user to, again, show them these areas that we could support them. So continuously now through this process, and you can start to see that beginning with November of 2013, the productivity began to raise because people were getting it. They're learning the processes. We're only having a couple more businesses come on board. But for the most part, all of our users are knowing where to go for that support, who to contact, and if they were new, we would guide them to the self-directed training that was available. So at this point, at the end of 2015, we were in a sustainable mode where our productivity was way over 80%, and the call volume was down to almost 200 to the help desk. So this was a huge success story to show that this is what the data was showing us and where we could address that support. Chris?
Carrie,
Yeah.
I love seeing this visualization. I've seen it a couple times, and I'm fully expecting to steal it at the City of Edmonton in a couple of years when I can have a similar trend line on my chart.
Yeah,
agreed.
All jokes aside, it's very powerful. I'm impressed by it too, Terry, in the sense, that you have the result, right? So using the super users at these core changes, and then, knowing that you could sustain that level of performance with such high turnover in the user base, and then obviously being able to discuss it. This is one of the more powerful data sets around, in the sense that we had this process under monitoring for several years. So really a great stuff and a great story.
Thank you.
Along.
It was an amazing adventure.
And another concept around, bringing information to the unique information. So this one's more about training and, does training work, right? So a lot of people are skeptical about the styles and the levels of investments and the lack of transparency into the results. And so, in this instance, we were looking at, the CRM agents again, how their hours, the correlation of how much training they're doing, how's it showing up in the results? And so unfortunately, the story was, well, from a waste perspective, the more people did training, or we really didn't see a change in their performance in terms of the waste as a percentage of the service orders that they were working on. And probably more disturbing, the same people that were spending more time on the training were, also, not doing as well in the eyes of the customer. So you could kind of look at that two ways. Is it a case of the people that are struggling have to keep going back? Or, in this instance, it was more a case of, staleness. If you're not revisiting the training and you're not revisiting the content on a good cycle, then really, you shouldn't necessarily expect the results to hold up over time. And so when we started to think about that concept and ask the questions asked, then is it the training or is it the people? And so when we dug down, we could see then that the old model, of user productivity training, and leaving it untouched for several years, over time that degraded, and so user productivity would fall. But the super user model, where we would keep the super users themselves trained on the more current content, and then cascade that back into the organization doing much better. So this is not necessarily a for or against training per se, but definitely the concept of the model of doing it once off and leaving it for several years. That just doesn't work. And so we know that, and we were able to prove then the efficacy of the two models. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to shut that down, and I'm going to jump back over to our PowerPoint, because we're sort of at the end here, and we've got to leave a little bit of time there for questions. But really, in closing, before we open it up again, we wanted to reiterate, that thinking about transparency, thinking about the ability to discuss economic impact, thinking about the ability to actually manage business risk. Well, historically, when we've done it flying blind, we've really relied on the expert opinions of a few individuals, maybe some surveys. Really, what I want to communicate here is it's much more objective when we're looking at millions of user clicks and then, transforming that information into something actionable. And then in addition to that, when we thought about economic impact, we focused on logins and head counts and guessing, really having metrics like the productivity and relative consumption are really much more scientific ways to sort of make decisions and really resonate, I think, with more of the mathies, the financial people. And then, finally, from a business risk perspective, the old way of really looking at rear view window reporting, waiting till people call a help desk, that is such an outdated model for managing business risk, when you're able to actually look at the consumption patterns in almost real time, and then look at, servicing the high-risk users. So really, in conclusion then, I hope that you found some interesting, thought-provoking things here about how user analytics could maybe change your job, make your impact more powerful. And with that, Anna, I'm going to pause and we'll throw it out there to questions again. See if any have come in.
Great, thanks, Chris. We did have a couple more questions come in, but audience members, we do have about 5 minutes left on the webcast. So if you do have questions for our speakers, now is the time to submit them. One question that came in earlier in the webcast, Chris, how does Neochange identify these productivity issues, technically speaking?
So if I understand that question, there's two aspects. One, there's sort of like, how do we measure productivity, right? So I think when we were looking at the user metabolism matrix earlier, we look at various factors. So the technology performance, we're looking at, the things that are specific to the individual. So, are they canceling transactions? Are they contacting the help desk? Are they activating the native help? In SAP itself, and then really how are they doing in terms of screen cycle times versus their process peers, right? It's really important to get good cohorts, good peer groups to compare. So that's one aspect in terms of, how we actually calculate it, if you will, and then we roll that up and look at it as a percentage of their time in SAP and put, a dollar valuation on that time, so we can use that as a guiding prioritization. So that's one concept. How do we measure it? How do we actually make that work? I think it goes back to sort of what Michael was touching on a little bit earlier. We're going to capture all the usage clicks at scale. We're going to transform, take them to our cloud, transform that, and then turn it into all these great metrics and pump that back to you in the views that we've been discussing. So that's sort of how I would address that question.
I'll jump in there too and harken back to my earlier comments about indicators. Depending on how detailed you want to get, I would often, when I talk about the productivity opportunity, I would often get, challenge is too strong a word, but a little bit of feedback or pushback on how exactly are we calculating these. So depending on your situation, it may or may not be of value to you to focus on what the percentage is or what the metrics are, and more focus on, look, we can quibble about what the amount is, whether there's $1 million productivity opportunity here or not. But really, it can be a powerful indicator to show you where you're, if you chart it on a graph, where are we weak, what are the biggest obstacles we face, and what are we good at, what are we not facing challenges with.
Great. Anna, any more?
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. One audience member wondering what areas are best suited for super users. Is one process area more suited than another? And for instance, corporate process versus a customer-facing process. And I'll go ahead and push that to the slide area.
Yep. Terry, you want to take that one?
I think all, when we talk about process areas, you want to look at where the heavier users are when we're looking at the usability, who's using the system, and where can you get the biggest bang for your buck for training. For example, Michael had mentioned earlier that there's a large investment in each and every user from an SAP standpoint, and when someone isn't utilizing the system as well as they can be, your organization looks at that productivity loss as dollars lost. And so where can you help save your organization's dollars in the areas where not only does it help the end user, they feel better about themselves, learning the process, less frustration with the system, but it's also then showing dollars saved because they can get through a transaction a lot quicker, get back to the job at hand, and move on to the next task. So when we talk about that, I would say that whatever the process, if it's being measured, has a lot of heavy user interface. Those are the ones where you want to focus super user support on, and not just super user support, but additional training and education in those areas as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Chris, I do have another question here about calculating user productivity and what that includes, but I think you may have covered that in a previous question. Did you or the other speakers have anything to add on that subject?
No, I think we addressed that adequately. So no, I would sort of move forward onto another one.
Okay, perfect. I do have one last question here in the queue. What kind of privacy issues do companies face when they start using user adoption analytics?
I can take a go at that first, and I know, Michael, you would at least have some opinions there because you have some unusual nuances with the city of Edmonton. Look, it's a real issue. I think that for us, we capture the data at the application server level, so that is better than desktop-based agents tend to bring in more privacy issues in Europe. But really, it's being sensible with the data, so we mask certain individuals where we need to, and then I think there needs to be a company decision thereafter of how far do they go with that. So we've had situations where customers have had to get approval from the European Work Council, their labor unions and so on, to do something with the data. So each company is different. So it's a legitimate concern, but ultimately this is a corporate application used in a corporate context. We're not monitoring, Facebook usage or something like that. So Usually companies find a way, and we've seen that in multiple industries, even, in defense and so on. So I don't know, Michael, do you have a sort of a extra flavor to add to that?
Not really. Privacy was one of the reasons why we initially thought we would only go down to the business area level. We do it at the user level, but then we roll them back up according to kind of our org chart. At the level of maturity that we're at in the use of the tool, there wasn't a lot of extra value in going down to that individual user level. And also, as I mentioned before, there is a little bit of squeamishness when people start thinking that you're scrutinizing their individual usage of the system. But as Chris said, we didn't feel there was any concern around sensitive data or anything along those kind of lines being sent up to the cloud. We were pretty comfortable with the type of data it was. So we may, at some point in the future, go down to that user level.
Yep, great. Thanks for that. Okay.
Perfect.
Any more?
And no, there are no more questions in the queue. Audience members, if you do have further questions after the webcast, you can submit them to affiliates@asug.com, and I'll make sure that they get sent on to the correct speaker. But for now, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Terry, Michael, and Chris, for a great webcast.
Thank you.
On behalf of ASUG,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Neochange, as well as all of you who took the time out today to attend this webcast. Once again, the recording and slides from today's program will be posted to the ASUG website, and all registrants will receive an email with a link to those materials. And with that, I'd like to close today's webcast. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.